Hi, guys, and welcome to another 7 minute lecture. The curious and eerie universality of Bigfoot stories, of Bigfoot lore. That's what we're looking at today. Now, don't worry, I'm not here to tell you that Bigfoot exists, nor am I here to tell you that it doesn't. I just find this whole thing really fascinating because even though I've never considered cryptozoology to be a credible discipline, and even though I personally do not believe in Bigfoot, I'm still amazed sometimes at how common and global this whole thing is. You all know what Bigfoot is, the basic legend of a large ape like bipedal creature. The first and most fascinating thing about this is that you find Bigfoot legends on essentially every continent on the planet, right? You can hear them being called a Bigfoot or Sasquatch in the Americas. It's called the Yowie in Australia, the Yeti in India, the Yeren in China, the Almas in Russia, Orang Pendek in Indonesia and Malaysia. Some call it the abominable snowman. You have Native American folklore that talks about giant bipedal ape-like creatures, and in a completely different hemisphere, you have Mongolian folklore where tribesmen have stories of a giant ape-like creature as well. The only real thing that differs in these stories is the color of the fur. So the Yeti in the Himalayas, for instance, is said to have white fur. The Canadian Sasquatch is most frequently described as having red fur, and so on. But the basic idea of a tall ape that walks on two legs remains the same. So, even though it's improbable and maybe even impossible for such a large creature to exist today without being documented by humans in a scientific way, even if you don't really believe that, like I do, that if you share my skepticism about that, it's still interesting that peasants in China report seeing more or less the same creature as farmers in California. Now, you could say, well, but these sightings are probably pranks or scams. These witnesses might be liars or they might be mistaken in some way. They saw something and they interpreted what they saw as a giant creature. We could say all that, and there is a high chance that this is probably the truth, which explains all these sightings. But it isn't just lay people who claim to have seen Bigfoot. The Russian army, I think back in the 30s, I can't remember for sure, claimed to have fought these things in caves. Many American GIs who served in Vietnam have stories of deeply forested areas where they encountered large groups of red-skinned apes, not orangutan either, but a bipedal version of it, often throwing rocks and stones at them. The Indian Army released photos of footprints a couple of years ago that it believed to be the Yeti. The Chinese government has actually sponsored high level expeditions back in the 70s into its wilderness in the Hubei province because they were there were simply too many reports and calls for help coming in from the locals. So they had to investigate. So it's interesting that even governments and armies around the world have claimed to encounter this creature. Other experts have been on board as well. There's a well known photograph taken way back in 1951 by the famous mountaineer Eric Shipton. The photos add these huge footprints on a mountain slope, and there's about 18,000 feet up in the air. It's almost impossible to fake something like that, especially since there are no adjoining footprints near that in the pictures. It's a smooth slope with just these giant footsteps making their way up and disappearing down the other side. And Eric Shipton wasn't exactly a con man. He's one of the greatest mountaineers of all time. It was his expedition in the Himalayas that discovered and laid out the route to cross the Khumbu Glacier, for example. He was the one who discovered how you can get to the Nanda Devi sanctuary through the Rishiganga Gorge. He's a legitimate mountaineering legend. And he claimed that these photographs were true. And he's not the only one who spent an entire lifetime in the outdoors among academics making such claims, or even adventurers. Way back in the 1700s, the famous American pioneer Daniel Boone claimed to have shot a giant, hairy, humanoid creature. Jane Goodall, arguably the world's leading expert on primates even today, believes Bigfoot to be real. Sir David Attenborough, my God, arguably the most famous biologist of the 20th century, the voice of nature itself, since he's the voice of planet Earth and life and countless other shows on nature. I mean, come on, we all know what Richard Attenborough's voice sounds like, right? So even he believes that Bigfoot is real, and he points out that modern science does accept that these things did exist at one point. We do know for a fact now that the Gigantopithecus, the giant ape, did exist all over China and Southeast Asia. So the only question is whether small portions of these things could have survived to the present day. And he also points out that if you've ever been to the Himalayas or the jungles of South China, you will immediately see how there are countless square miles of snowy mountains or dense jungle that human beings have simply never ventured into to this very day. And he also points out how any primate creature that is indigenous to these regions will be well aware of your presence far before you are aware of its presence, because these places are just so unimaginably vast. So the argument has often been made, the counter argument, that a creature of that size would leave behind too many traces. It would leave behind bones or feces or fur or something like that, which we can collect and document. And the fact that we still find nothing of that sort, many say, is proof that Bigfoot doesn't exist. And of course, the fact that we have so many obvious hoaxes claiming to be Bigfoot sightings and all that, that doesn't help either. But David Attenborough feels that in many parts of the world where you have hundreds of square miles that no human being has ever ventured into, not even Sherpa or tribesmen or whatever, it is feasible for small populations of these things to exist and go relatively unnoticed. And Attenborough isn't someone who's prone to making these superstitious statements that are anti-science either, right? So I just want to discuss this real quick since I've always found it interesting. As I said earlier, I'm personally skeptical of all this, but it's hard to deny how eerie the coincidence is that Sherpas in Nepal and pioneers in America and farmers in Indonesia and Aboriginal hunters in New Zealand, that all of them, none of whom have ever had any kind of contact with each other, that all have such eerily similar descriptions of the same creature. That to this day, for instance, many Mongolians claim that in the late autumn time, you can see entire families of Yeti migrating in the horizon. In a way, I guess you could argue that it doesn't even matter if Bigfoot is real, if it actually exists, because if Bigfoot doesn't exist, then that makes the universality of this myth even more bizarre and even more amazing, that every continent could just spontaneously fabricate something which never existed, right? So if you like content like this, please don't forget to share and subscribe. Thank you, take care, and I'll see you soon.